A female judge's romantic affair with a cop ends in double murder. The cold air of January 29, 2008, hung heavily over the small town of Osceola Township, Michigan. The streets, typically serene and dotted with snow-covered houses, were suddenly alive with flashing red and blue lights. A muffled hum of sirens cut through the otherwise peaceful evening, as police cruisers swarmed the Kowalski family's suburban home. Within moments, the scene inside would become the stuff of nightmares. Inside the Kowalskis' home, Richard and Brenda Kowalski were discovered lifeless, lying in a pool of their own blood. The couple had been brutally shot execution-style in their living room. Richard, 61, a retired GM engineer, and Brenda, his wife, were not just victims of a random act of violence. They were well known in the community, active in local charity work, and highly respected figures in Livingston County. To those who knew them, the Kowalskis were the embodiment of middle-class Americana, successful, family-oriented, and deeply embedded in the fabric of their small town. But now, that world was shattered. The police arrived on the scene to find a crime that had all the markings of a professional hit. The bodies were found in an unnatural stillness, their limbs sprawled on the floor, blood staining the once pristine carpet. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or forced entry. The killer had entered the house with familiarity, someone the Kowalskis knew, someone who had been trusted to walk through their door. Detective Mike Jackson was one of the first on the scene. He had seen his fair share of violent crimes over the years, but nothing about this case sat right with him. The Kowalskis' murder didn't feel like a robbery gone wrong, or a domestic dispute turned deadly. This was something else. The lack of forced entry was particularly telling. The couple had likely opened the door to their killer willingly. But who could it be? As Jackson and his team started combing through the house for clues, their focus soon turned to a name that none of them had expected to become entwined with the crime. It was the name of someone they all knew, Judge Teresa Brennan. Judge Brennan had a reputation as one of the most respected figures in Livingston County's judicial system. With her sharp mind, commanding presence, and dedication to her job, she had become the face of local justice. But the investigators soon learned that beneath the polished, public facade of Brennan's career, there were secrets that had long been hidden from public view. It didn't take long for the police to connect the dots between Brennan and the Kowalski case. Detective Sean Furlong, the lead investigator on the scene, had worked closely with Brennan for years. Furlong, a Michigan state trooper, was known as a meticulous and hard-working officer, and like Brennan, he had deep ties to the local legal community. The two had interacted numerous times in the courtroom. Their professional relationship had grown over time, and while there were no initial concerns, something about their connection was beginning to look suspicious. Furlong had testified in numerous cases that Brennan had presided over, and the two were frequently seen together outside of work, socializing, attending local events, and even spending time at Brennan's lakeside cottage. At first, it appeared innocent enough, just colleagues and friends bonding outside the work environment. But as the investigation continued to unfold, dark and twisted truths about their relationship began to emerge. Detective Jackson stared at the crime scene, the weight of the Kowalski murders pressing down on him. The investigation, still in its early stages, had already taken a turn for the worse. The community was in shock. The very idea of a double murder in such a quiet, peaceful neighborhood almost impossible to comprehend. Who would want to hurt Richard and Brenda Kowalski? And why? The police had quickly ruled out a random robbery. There was no sign of forced entry, and the bodies had been discovered in a position that suggested familiarity, not violence driven by desperation. The Kowalskis had opened their door to their killer, which meant the murderer was someone they knew. But who? And how was Judge Teresa Brennan involved in all of this? As the investigation began to dig deeper into Brennan's life, the truth started to unravel in ways no one expected. What initially seemed like an innocent connection between the judge and Detective Furlong was quickly becoming something far more sinister. Furlong was one of the last people to see the Kowalskis alive, and, as the lead investigator, he had been the one to interrogate Jerome Kowalski, the prime suspect in his brother's murder. The fact that Furlong had been spending more and more time with Brennan, both professionally and socially, was now under scrutiny. The first inkling of something more than a professional relationship came when Kaiser, the lawyer representing Brennan's husband in their pending divorce, began making waves. Thomas Kaiser was a seasoned lawyer with an extensive history of taking on difficult cases. He had long been critical of Brennan's career and had been a thorn in her side during her time as a judge. So when he got wind of a potential scandal involving Brennan and Furlong, he wasted no time in investigating. His gut told him something was deeply wrong, but he had no idea just how dark the reality would turn out to be. Through subpoenaing Brennan's phone records and digging through public documents, Kaiser discovered that Brennan had been in frequent contact with Furlong long before the murders. Phone logs revealed a striking number of calls between the two, some lasting over an hour. The timing was curious. These calls began long before the Kowalski trial, when both Brennan and Furlong had become familiar with the details of the case. Could these calls have been more than just friendly conversations? Could they have been part of a cover-up? Kaiser's investigation didn't just stop there. He found out about Brennan's intimate social gatherings with Furlong, meetings that were becoming increasingly private and secretive. As the pieces began to fall into place, it became painfully clear that the relationship between the judge and the trooper was far more than professional. This wasn't simply an affair. It was a dangerous, volatile situation that threatened to destroy the careers of two prominent figures in Livingston County. But what did this affair have to do with the Kowalski murders? The answer, it seemed, lay in the twisted web of emotions, power, and betrayal that had been festering beneath the surface for years. While Furlong and Brennan both maintained that their romantic relationship had only begun after the Kowalski trial, others close to them painted a different picture. A former colleague of Brennan's, who had worked with her for several years, testified under oath that Brennan had admitted to an affair with Furlong much earlier, potentially as far back as 2009, long before the trial. They had reportedly kissed during a late-night meeting in her chambers, a moment that was awkward and surprising to both. It was a shocking admission that added a new layer of complexity to the case. Could this affair have started long before the murders? And was it the real catalyst behind the violence that followed? As Kaiser continued to dig, new revelations emerged. He uncovered financial records that hinted at more than just an emotional entanglement between the judge and the trooper. Both had engaged in secret trips, often to remote locations. Furlong had even accompanied Brennan to her cottage on Lake Michigan. But the most damning piece of evidence came when phone records revealed multiple calls between Brennan and Furlong during the Kowalski murder trial itself. The fact that the two had spoken at length during a high-profile case involving Furlong, the lead detective, was a troubling red flag. Was their connection interfering with the investigation? Had the judge compromised her role in the trial by maintaining such personal contact with one of the primary witnesses? But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came when Kaiser subpoenaed Furlong himself. In his deposition, Furlong was asked directly about the nature of his relationship with Brennan. Under oath, he denied having any contact with her during the trial, a statement that was immediately contradicted by Brennan herself. Sitting in the same room, Brennan interrupted the proceedings, insisting that the two had spoken at least once during the trial, but that it was merely a casual conversation. Furlong seemed nervous, his testimony faltering. The defense lawyer, Kaiser, accused Furlong of trying to cover up his relationship with Brennan, of engaging in a deliberate campaign to mislead investigators and the public. It became clear that their relationship was not just a scandal, but a potential cause for concern in terms of judicial integrity. As the investigation snowballed, the community of Livingston County, which had once placed its trust in these two respected public figures, was rocked by a cascade of shocking details. The small, tightly knit town could no longer deny the mounting evidence of impropriety, nor could it ignore the possibility that the Kowalski murders were only the tip of the iceberg in a much darker and more disturbing story. Detective Jackson had seen his fair share of complex cases, but nothing in his career had prepared him for the web of lies and deception he was now tangled in. The deeper he dug into the lives of Teresa Brennan and Sean Furlong, the more disturbing the connections became. It wasn't just an affair. It was a carefully orchestrated pattern of manipulation and concealment, a pattern that had now left two people dead and a community reeling. As the investigation into the Kowalski murders continued to unfold, the involvement of Judge Brennan became more and more undeniable. But what was her role? Was she simply a bystander in this tragic tale, caught up in a relationship that had gone too far? Or was she actively complicit in the deaths of Richard and Brenda Kowalski, orchestrating their murders from behind the scenes? It was only when Detective Jackson and his team began to examine the timeline surrounding the murders that things started to make sense. Richard Kowalski, a former GM engineer with a quiet demeanor, and his wife Brenda, had lived a peaceful life. On the surface, they were an ordinary couple, but the truth was far more complicated. The Kowalskis had been caught up in the tangled lives of those around them, particularly in the years leading up to their deaths. The night of May 1st, 2008, when Richard and Brenda were found shot dead in their home in Osceola Township, had been violent but meticulously planned. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. But what stood out were the details of the crime scene, the manner in which the victims were positioned, and the fact that Richard's brother, Jerome Kowalski, was the one who had discovered the bodies. Jerome's testimony would become a pivotal part of the investigation, though it would also raise several questions. He was the one who had found the bodies, but his odd behavior during the police questioning made Detective Jackson wary. Jerome was emotional, but his responses seemed rehearsed, as if he were trying too hard to appear innocent. As the hours of interrogation stretched on, it became clear that there was more to this story than met the eye. What Detective Jackson would later learn was that Jerome had been under intense pressure from law enforcement for over 3 days. The Michigan State Police, led by Furlong, had interrogated him for hours on end, using every trick in the book to get a confession. Furlong's methods were aggressive and, at times, coercive. He wanted a confession, and he wasn't about to let Jerome get off the hook without one. But as the pressure mounted, something troubling began to emerge. Jerome had made statements that suggested he had been manipulated. Furlong's actions were starting to look like more than just investigative work. The truth came out when Kaiser, in his pursuit to uncover the full extent of Brennan's and Furlong's involvement, subpoenaed a key piece of evidence: the phone records from the night of the murders. What Jackson and Kaiser discovered sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. During the night of the Kowalskis' murder, Brennan and Furlong had exchanged multiple phone calls. This was not a coincidence. This was a direct connection between the judge and the lead detective during the very time when the Kowalskis were likely being murdered. Brennan had called Furlong 3 times, each call lasting several minutes. Could they have been discussing the case? Could the affair have escalated to a point where it was now affecting the outcome of an entire investigation? The phone records were a smoking gun. The fact that Furlong and Brennan were in constant contact, especially during such a high-profile case, raised serious questions about the integrity of the entire investigation. Were the Kowalskis murdered because they had learned too much about the affair? Had they become collateral damage in a dangerous web of deceit? Or had Furlong been so emotionally tied to Brennan that he was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect her, no matter the cost? Detective Jackson continued to dig into Furlong's history. What he found was chilling. Furlong had a pattern of covering up his personal affairs at any cost. Whether it was bending the rules to protect himself or using his position of power to silence anyone who might stand in his way, Furlong had shown a disturbing willingness to cross moral and legal lines. And now, it seemed that his connection with Brennan had escalated into something even darker. The more Jackson uncovered, the clearer it became that Furlong's involvement in the Kowalski murders wasn't just a coincidence. He had been the one to lead the investigation, the one to interrogate Jerome Kowalski, and, most crucially, the one to testify at the trial that eventually convicted Jerome of the murders. Furlong had been a key player in securing the conviction, and now it seemed that he had been covering his tracks all along. But it wasn't just Furlong who was under suspicion. Brennan's role was increasingly coming into focus. As the judge who had presided over the Kowalski trial, Brennan had been responsible for ensuring a fair and just outcome. Yet, her personal relationship with Furlong cast a shadow of doubt over everything. Had she allowed her personal feelings for the detective to cloud her judgment? Had she knowingly allowed Furlong to manipulate the case, knowing that her actions could lead to a wrongful conviction? The moral implications of this case were staggering. If Brennan had known about the murder and had been complicit in covering up the truth, she would not only be guilty of judicial misconduct but also of aiding and abetting murder. It was a betrayal not just of the law, but of the very trust placed in her by the community she was supposed to serve. And if Furlong had used his position to shield Brennan and manipulate the investigation, he would be guilty of not just murder but also a gross abuse of power. At this point in the investigation, both Furlong and Brennan were facing mounting pressure. As the case against them grew stronger, their once perfectly crafted lives began to crumble. And yet, the most chilling part of the story was still to come. Who, exactly, was the mastermind behind the Kowalski murders? Was Furlong simply a pawn in Brennan's game, or had he been complicit from the beginning? And how deep did their conspiracy go? Was there more at stake here than just a corrupt judge and a rogue cop? As Detective Jackson dug deeper into their twisted relationship, the question still loomed. Why were Richard and Brenda Kowalski really killed? Was it just about a tragic love affair gone wrong? Or was there a more sinister motive at play? As Jackson prepared for the next step in his investigation, he knew that the answers to these questions would be just as shocking as the murders themselves. Detective Jackson spent sleepless nights poring over evidence, piecing together the fragmented stories that surrounded the Kowalski case. Every lead he followed seemed to spiral into more complications. The once simple murder investigation had turned into a nightmare of manipulation, betrayal, and deception. But it wasn't just the phone calls between Judge Brennan and Detective Furlong that weighed heavily on Jackson's mind. It was something far darker, a discovery that would shatter the thin veneer of respectability both had cultivated for years. As Jackson dug into the details of the affair between Brennan and Furlong, he began to uncover a disturbing pattern, one that suggested not only betrayal within the confines of the law but a complete breakdown of moral integrity within the justice system itself. The affair between Brennan and Furlong wasn't a fleeting moment of passion or a private affair gone public. It was a dangerous entanglement, one that intertwined with the very core of the criminal justice system. Furlong, a trusted state trooper, had been a regular presence in Brennan's life, both professionally and personally, for years. What started as friendly outings to sporting events and weekends at Brennan's cottage soon grew into something more intimate and clandestine. Yet, as Jackson's investigation began to peel back the layers, the timing of their affair became increasingly suspicious. While Furlong and Brennan had both insisted that their romantic involvement had only started after the Kowalski trial, Jackson's relentless pursuit of the truth revealed otherwise. Phone records weren't the only evidence pointing to a timeline that contradicted their statements. Depositions from witnesses began to paint a far grimmer picture. Sean Ryan, an assistant prosecutor in Livingston County, had worked closely with both Brennan and Furlong. In his deposition, he recalled a conversation with Brennan during a break in a case around 2009, where she had mentioned a kiss with Furlong, an intimate moment that occurred long before the Kowalski trial. This revelation sent a chilling ripple through the investigation. If Brennan and Furlong had been involved in a romantic relationship for years, it raised a devastating question. Had they been manipulating the outcomes of their cases for personal gain? Or worse, covering up crimes they were involved in? Ryan's testimony confirmed what Jackson had begun to fear. Brennan and Furlong's relationship was not just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated, ongoing conspiracy that stretched far beyond the courtroom and into the personal lives of those they were sworn to serve and protect. And this wasn't just about a single trial gone awry. It was about an entire system that could have been corrupted by their influence. But it wasn't only the emotional betrayal that disturbed Jackson. It was the profound ethical breach they had committed as public servants. Brennan had presided over cases in which Furlong was either directly involved or had been a key witness. Their personal relationship had created a dangerous conflict of interest, leaving an entire community vulnerable to the whims of two people who had no business occupying positions of such trust and authority. The question that hung in the air was now unavoidable. Had Brennan's ruling in the Kowalski trial been influenced by her affair with Furlong? The Kowalski family, still reeling from their father's conviction, had always maintained that Jerome Kowalski was innocent. They believed his confession was coerced by the very man, Furlong, who had been so heavily involved in the case. Despite repeated efforts to bring attention to the false confession, Brennan had dismissed all appeals and motions, upholding her ruling with unwavering certainty. To make matters worse, her failure to allow expert testimony regarding false confessions had gutted the defense, leaving Jerome with no viable path to challenge the evidence against him. As the layers of this case peeled away, Jackson couldn't ignore the growing sense of injustice. Jerome Kowalski, a man with no prior criminal history, had spent almost 5 years in jail before his trial even began. The case against him was built on a confession extracted under duress, one that had been riddled with inconsistencies and forced admissions. In the face of all this, Judge Brennan had chosen to stand by her ruling, condemning an innocent man to life behind bars. Jackson's investigation into Brennan and Furlong's motives didn't just reveal the sordid details of their affair. It revealed the true extent of their control over the justice system in Livingston County. What had started as a corrupt relationship between a judge and a police officer had spiraled into a dangerous alliance, capable of manipulating not just one case, but potentially many others. But there was one final piece of the puzzle, one that would bring the entire conspiracy to its devastating conclusion. Through subpoenas and court records, Kaiser had managed to uncover evidence that suggested Brennan had been well aware of Furlong's manipulations, not just in the Kowalski case but in several others. It appeared that Furlong, with Brennan's silent consent, had been using his position to intimidate witnesses, influence cases, and sway the outcomes of trials. Their affair had given Furlong unprecedented access to the judicial system, and with it, the ability to control outcomes, particularly those that involved people he had personal grudges against or wanted to protect. What Kaiser uncovered next sent the investigation into overdrive. Phone records, personal emails, and witness testimonies began to confirm that Brennan had used her position as a judge to shield Furlong from accusations of misconduct and had repeatedly obstructed attempts to investigate his actions. Even when there were complaints about Furlong's aggressive tactics during interrogations, Brennan had taken steps to protect him, dismissing any concerns raised by defense attorneys or fellow law enforcement officers. The true depth of the corruption was becoming undeniable. Brennan and Furlong weren't just two individuals who had crossed the line. They had created a system where their personal relationship blurred every boundary of professional integrity. Together, they had put innocent lives at risk and manipulated the law for their own benefit. And they had done so without remorse. As Jackson pieced together the final moments of this investigation, it was clear that the case was far from over. There were still more questions than answers, and the people involved in this web of lies were about to face the consequences of their actions. But even as Brennan and Furlong faced growing pressure, the community was left with a devastating realization. How much trust had been broken. How many innocent lives had been affected by this corrupted system. The truth was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. And as the investigation reached its climax, Jackson couldn't help but wonder if anyone would ever fully understand the true motives behind the murders. Had the Kowalskis truly been killed for knowing too much about Brennan and Furlong? Or was there something more sinister at play, something that neither Jackson nor anyone else had yet uncovered? As the investigation into Judge Brennan and Detective Furlong reached its breaking point, the people of Livingston County were left to reckon with the devastating truth. A web of lies and corruption had taken root at the heart of their justice system, one that they had trusted for years. The case that had begun as a simple double murder investigation had now become an intricate puzzle of moral decay, broken laws, and lives ruined in its wake. But even as the walls closed in on Brennan and Furlong, the real question lingered. How far had this corruption spread, and who else might be implicated? Detective Jackson, having spent months unraveling this complex case, now found himself grappling with the question that had haunted him since the very beginning. What happens when those sworn to uphold justice become the very ones who betray it? The answer was as clear as it was unsettling. The entire system had been compromised, and the damage caused by Brennan and Furlong's actions was far-reaching. Their affair, their manipulation of the law, and their ability to operate without fear of consequence had broken the faith of the very people they were meant to protect. Judge Teresa Brennan's fall from grace was swift but inevitable. As the investigation deepened, the public began to demand answers. A flood of angry calls, letters, and petitions erupted from the citizens of Livingston County, many of whom had once revered Brennan as a fair and impartial judge. To them, the idea that their judicial system had been so easily corrupted was a bitter pill to swallow. The state of Michigan was forced to take action. The Judicial Tenure Commission, which polices the conduct of judges, launched an immediate investigation into Brennan's actions. In an unprecedented move, Michigan State Police executed a search warrant on Brennan's chambers and seized her records, hoping to uncover more evidence that might expose the full extent of her involvement in the conspiracy. It was only a matter of time before Brennan was formally charged with misconduct, perjury, and obstruction of justice. The case against her was damning. The phone records, the admissions from Furlong and other witnesses, and the testimony of those who had seen the judge and trooper together in compromising situations. The affair between the two had tainted every ruling she had made during their relationship, raising suspicions about how many verdicts might have been influenced by their personal involvement. In the end, Brennan's reputation was irreparably destroyed. She resigned from her position as a judge, and her legal career came crashing down in disgrace. But the real tragedy was the fallout from her actions. Jerome Kowalski, who had been convicted in the very court she presided over, found new hope. His conviction, once seemingly unbreakable, was now in jeopardy. His defense team, armed with the new revelations about Brennan and Furlong's misconduct, filed an appeal, arguing that he had been denied a fair trial and that his confession, extracted under duress, should have never been admissible in court. The wheels of justice began to turn in Kowalski's favor. His case, once dismissed by a system that appeared invulnerable, was now being reconsidered with the seriousness it had long deserved. But even as his legal team prepared for a new trial, a darker truth began to emerge. Who else had been harmed by the corruption within the system? Furlong's downfall was equally swift but far more tragic. The once decorated Michigan State Trooper, who had spent years serving the people of Livingston County, was now facing a host of criminal charges. He was accused of using his position to manipulate cases, intimidate witnesses, and forge a toxic relationship with Brennan that had resulted in multiple miscarriages of justice. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Phone records, depositions, witness testimonies, and it became increasingly clear that Furlong had used his affair with Brennan to exploit the power he had within the judicial system. Unlike Brennan, who had resigned in disgrace, Furlong's legal battle was still ongoing. He faced multiple charges, including witness tampering, perjury, and misconduct in office. His defense team tried to argue that his relationship with Brennan had been purely personal and had no bearing on his professional actions. But no one believed it. The very fact that he had been so involved in one of the most high-profile murder cases in Livingston County history made his involvement in the scandal even more damning. Furlong's life, once filled with promises of law enforcement glory, had spiraled into chaos. His personal life had unraveled with the affair, and now his career had crumbled under the weight of his illegal actions. To make matters worse, the people he had once worked with in the police department were now questioning how many other cases had been tainted by his actions. The community that had once viewed him as a protector now saw him as a betrayer of trust, someone who had abused his power for personal gain. As the dust settled in Livingston County, the aftermath of Brennan and Furlong's actions left the community grappling with the consequences of their betrayal. The justice system, which had once been a pillar of fairness and impartiality, was now viewed with skepticism and distrust. What had once been a shining example of law enforcement and judicial integrity had now been exposed as a breeding ground for corruption and abuse of power. But the ripple effects of this scandal didn't stop at the courthouse. The Kowalski family, whose lives had been turned upside down by the conviction of an innocent man, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Jerome Kowalski, having spent nearly 5 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit, was now fighting for his freedom. His case was a symbol of the broader failure of the justice system, a reminder of how a single individual's corruption could ruin the lives of many innocent people. For the citizens of Livingston County, the scandal had left a scar that would not easily heal. The emotional toll on the community was deep. People began to question their trust in the very institutions they had once relied upon. The police, the judges, the lawyers, they were all suspects now. And in the aftermath of it all, one truth remained. The line between justice and corruption had been blurred, and the consequences would be felt for years to come. But as the final gavel fell on the case, there remained one haunting question. What would have happened if Brennan and Furlong hadn't been caught? Would the justice system in Livingston County have continued to be a facade of fairness, with no one the wiser to the betrayal that lay beneath? How many more cases had been influenced by their actions? How many innocent people had been wrongly convicted? Or worse, had their lives destroyed by the manipulations of two corrupt individuals? In the end, the case was more than just about one man's fight for freedom. It was a reflection of the very nature of justice itself. The people of Livingston County were left to confront the uncomfortable reality that their justice system had been compromised, not by an external force, but by those who were meant to serve and protect them. As for Jerome Kowalski, the battle for his freedom was far from over. But one thing was clear. The truth had finally come to light, and it had shaken the very foundations of the law.